So a frame is kind of the idea of the conversation, or you can look at it as the set of underlying assumptions of a conversation that give it its meaning. And the easiest way to explain frame is probably by example, because it's one of those things people intuitively understand, but it is hard to define, a little bit like jazz. You know, they say like, I don't know what it is, but I know it when I hear it, or I can't define it, but I know it when I hear it. Or actually, I think that's the definition of jazz and also the definition of pornography. I don't know what it is. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. Same kind of thing with frames. We understand them. So if you are in a business meeting, or say you go to a job interview, right? The frame of the job interview dictates how the people are going to interact in that interview. It dictates who's in charge. It dictates who wants something from whom. It dictates the type of content that's going to fill in that frame. And so when you have that mutual understanding, you have a certain type of conversation, a certain type of back and forth exchange. Whereas if you met the exact same person that is going to give you a job interview, if you met him, in line at Starbucks, you might have a very different conversation. Or if you met him like, at a company picnic party and you're already have the job, you might have a very different conversation. So the context and the understanding, the shared understanding, or at the start it might not be shared, but what's becoming the understanding of the conversation dictates the content of that conversation. It dictates what everything within that conversation means. So that's the idea of a frame. All right, the idea of a frame is the set of assumptions that you're making about an interaction or a relationship that dictate the meaning. And again, the very same action might be very different in one context or another. Like for example, with a woman, if you, randomly everything's going well and you happen to give her a gift, that has one meaning. If you happen to be in a fight and you appear to have been in the wrong during that fight and then you give her a gift, that gift now is taken as a completely different thing. Maybe it's an apology, maybe it's a way of kissing up, who knows? But it's different than if it was given without that context around it, as an example. Same thing with things you say to a woman, right? If you are giving a girl a hard time, well, under a certain context, that may mean you don't like her. Under another context, that might mean you do like her and you're taking the time and energy to pay attention and give her a bit of an emotional roller coaster and be playful with her. And that's where flirting comes in. So flirting is the sort of lighthearted exchange that you have with women that sets certain frames. So first of all, the fact that it is lighthearted and not serious and logical sets a frame of a friendly emotional connection rather than a logical exchange of facts. So that's one of the frames that flirting is setting. Another big frame that flirting is setting is the idea that there is a man-to-woman component of what's going on. So the idea that you bring up a potential dating future or potential sexual future, or you're even willing to just reference, sexual topics, or you're willing to say things that are a little bit taboo or not entirely politically correct. All of those things are setting a frame and creating a certain vibe in which a relationship can grow, in which it's safe to interact in a sexual manner back for the girl, in which the girl is experiencing a range of emotions, etc. Right? So there's a lot of frames, one being the man-to-woman frame, another being a playful frame, and other frames being who is of value in the conversation, who's chasing whom, etc., etc. But that's the idea of frames in general and also as it pertains to flirting. There's two ways of establishing a frame, first of all. The more typical one that's considered is what's called reframing, which is changing an existing frame to be more favorable for you. And this is things like passing shit tests, for example, things like misinterpretation, for example, things like if the girl has a particular idea, a societal kind of idea of how the man-to-woman interaction works, you can do things that are kind of contrary to that and possibly even like jarring or throw that off, etc. And that all works to an extent. In fact, it all works to a great extent, but it's hard. It's a lot harder to change an existing frame than it is to set a frame in the first place. So it's much easier and usually much better to go in with your frame pre-established or have an idea of what that frame is and to kind of get there first. So if you're the first person in the conversation asserting a frame, you're the first person who is deciding what meaning you'd like to have put on the conversation, the other person is in a more difficult spot in terms of controlling the frame, because if you are actively trying to control the frame, if you're actively trying to change the meaning of things and it comes off that you're actively doing or that you have a plan or an agenda, it's less effective. The best frame control should be subtle. It should appear like it's almost not happening, right? It should appear almost accidental. And so if you are being pushy or forceful in your frame control, it's going to be less effective. And therefore, it's a lot easier to establish a frame without a contrary frame to push against It's better to pre-frame, to put it out there in the first place, than it is to reframe. In terms of ways that you can pre-frame, for example, storytelling is an absolutely great one. So if you're telling a story about yourself, you are framing yourself within that story by what facts you choose to include, what facts you choose to omit, what words you use, what the content of the story is, what it implies about you, how people are treating you within that story, et cetera, et cetera. So storytelling is a great example of pre-framing. Also, the way that you answer questions, you can look at answering questions as sort of reflexive storytelling, in that you're telling a story as the answer to the question. Even if it's just a few words, that those few words are a few words of story, right? So whenever you're communicating who you are, whenever you're communicating your beliefs, those kind of things, you are setting a frame. The other thing that you can do to set a frame, which is very important in terms of pre-framing, is to begin the flirtatious frame as early as possible. So if you have half an hour of discussion of Excel tables and mathematical formulas, that's not going to become flirty, and it's going to be a big step to make that flirty later. Whereas if you are joking around at the start, if you are a little less formal with your language, a little more willing to say things that are less politically correct at the start, that's all going to go a long way. If you will make some acknowledgments of the fact that you're a man and she's a woman, for example, early on, that's going to set you in a good light and in a good direction for future flirtation. Because again, pre-framing is a lot easier than reframing. It's not to say reframing can't be done. Essentially, if your frame is stronger than the other person in the interaction, then you are going to largely be successful at reframing, but it's a longer process, a tougher process, and it's going to feel like something was done. The person's going to feel like they got frame controlled. Nobody likes to feel frame controlled. It's much easier when frame control just happens. It's also much easier when the frame that you're inviting someone into, I notice I said inviting someone into, not putting someone into, because you can do both, but inviting is better. But the frame that you're inviting someone into, if it's a good place, if it's a fun place, a nice place, a happy place, a place they enjoy being, that's going to make it tremendously easier to set and control frames. There's kind of a couple categories of this. One is frames you have for yourself and your view of the world, and the other is frames that you kind of enact on the interaction. And I guess they're the same in a way, because if you have it for yourself in the world, you should be sort of subtly enacting it on the interaction. But it's sort of like an inner game, outer game thing, or like a self-talk and then manifestation thing. So views that are very helpful in general about yourself are the view that you have value to offer, that people like talking to you, and that you are providing a service or a positive when you're having a conversation with someone rather than a negative, right? The other views that are usually helpful about yourself are that you are attractive, right, in one way or another, even if you're not like a supermodel, like a male supermodel or whatever. If you believe that you do have some attractive qualities, if you believe you have a great smile, if you believe that you're funny, if you believe that you have a good body, if you believe, et cetera, those are all positives. The more positive things you believe about yourself, the better your kind of inherent frame is going to be. And that's going to come through in a lot of subtle ways. It's going to come through in terms of the implications you make. It's going to come through in terms of the assumptions that you are allowing yourself to take and putting into the conversation, etc. And then there's the frame in terms of how you actually interact with the girl. And there, part of the frame is that, well, one example of a good frame is that that's like sex is normal and natural, right? If your frame is very anti-sexual or prudish, or very like religiously conservative, like let's not have sex till marriage, etc. That's going to certainly set frames that are not going to help you early on in a relationship with making things more man to woman, making them sexual, etc., etc. So that's one example. Although funny enough, when you talk about religiously conservative, that actually can be flipped on its head. I've known guys who are religiously conservative, and they actually use that as a way of, instead of making the interaction non-sexual, they make the interaction about the fact that the girl is not going to be able to convince them to have sex due to their religious conservatism, and then the girl actually will chase them oftentimes. So even if that is a fact of your life, there's a way to present it that's likely to actually enhance the flirtatious nature of the conversation, and there's a way to present it in a way that would actually detract from the flirtatious nature of the conversation. So even regardless of that being an inherent frame you'd think is negative, it's about how it's conveyed and about the story you're telling around it, more so than the actual facts themselves in many, many cases. So again, sexual openness, usually good. The willingness to talk about or bring sex into the conversation, almost universally good. And that would be the kind of the distinction in the previous example I just gave. So that's one example. The other one is the frame of not taking things too seriously. The idea or the frame that you are self-sufficient, that you are enough without the girl, and so you don't need her validation, you don't need her love and respect, you don't need her affection. You'd like it, it's fun, it's great, and you're in favor of it, but you don't need it, because neediness tends to be very, very unattractive. So the idea that you're enough and you can take the girl or leave the girl is a very powerful frame to have on many, many levels. Excuse me, both in terms of conveying sort of that you are attractive and triggering attraction in her, but also in terms of setting up like very good dynamics in terms of the back and forth and the negotiation of the interaction. Another good frame is the frame of that you're there to have fun and have an experience rather than to get an outcome. Right? If your goal is I want to sleep with this girl to make me feel better about myself or to run up my leg count or something like that, that vibe is very, it's all about you. It's not about her, and it's not very win-win. Whereas if it's let's have a fun time together and see where it goes, that's a frame she can get on board with, and is a frame you can even explain to the girl or just like even flat out like quote from, so to speak, in the conversation, and the conversation will go a lot more smoothly for having had that frame in it. Another frame that I think is really effective is the frame of affectionate but not taking it very seriously, which is kind of the frame that you would treat a well-loved child or pet in a way. So say for example, if there's a smart, precocious like 9-year-old who you're just good friends with, or like maybe if, they're your neighbor's kid or something like that, and you like the kid, you respect him, he's cool, you love to hang out with him, he's a good kid. But that said, he's 9 years old. So if he has some view on like some view on politics or religion or some deep subject, you're gonna be like, oh, that's cool, and you'll listen to him, you'll humor him, and he may even make a good point, but you're just not taking him quite as seriously as if he was an adult or an authority in that area. It's the same kind of a thing with a girl, which is that you care about her, you love her, you want her to have a great time, you want her to have a positive experience with you, but end of the day, you believe what you believe, you know what you know about the world, and it's going to take a lot for her to push your frame. Not to say that you never can, not to say that you'll never be wrong or anything like that, and then not to say that you should never adjust, but your assumption should be that your frames are probably correct. And this actually should be your assumption, with people in general, because your frames hopefully came from somewhere. They came from your life experience, they came from some deep thought and understanding and practice and whatnot. But the idea is you have a strong frame, and you're not going to just automatically shoot down every other frame. You're not going to be harsh towards their frame. You're not going to be like mean or belittling or anything like that. But you're also just in good humor. It's like, oh, okay, fair point. That's cool. Now here's the truth, right? Or they're going to say something like, oh, that's cute, that's fun, come here, I like you, and then you're just not even going to acknowledge it necessarily if it doesn't merit acknowledgement, right? So. Just this idea that in a positive way, in a fun way, in a caring way, you're not as willing to budge on your frame as they are, because generally the person who's following the other person's frame is the person that's going to have more sort of control or say, or they're going to be the leader in the interaction. So having a bit of a hard frame is very, very useful, but in a playful way, because again, no one wants to feel frame controlled. What they'd like to do is to have whatever is in their frame that's keeping them from having fun, whatever's in their frame that's keeping them from having that amazing experience they'd like to with a guy, they'd like to have that replaced, at least temporarily, with some more fun things that allow them to go ahead and have the experience they'd really like to have without being slutty about it, without being, without it being a problem for them, without it hurting their reputation, without them feeling unsafe, etc. So frame control really should be like frame leadership or frame like invitation to have a great experience without negative consequences.